Color of silence. My ex-husband Doug and I didn't find it out until well into our time together that our families had previously intersected in a most unsettling way. My parents were born and raised in New Orleans. Their families had immigrated from Europe a couple of generations back. In my dad's case, from France and Germany, and in my mom's case, from England and Scotland. And scattered in the ancestry were some Cajuns, people who had come down from Arcadia, Nova Scotia after a civil war in the 18th century and landed in Southeast Louisiana. My dad was one of 10 kids, 7 of whom stayed in New Orleans all their lives. And we were pro-integration people. And we couched it as integration because in the 50s and 60s, that's what we saw in the news and on TV. We saw in 1957 that Eisenhower was sending troops to Little Rock High School to integrate it. We saw that the Freedom Riders in the early 60s were traveling on buses through Alabama and Mississippi to integrate lunch counters. So we didn't talk about equality and civil rights so much as integration. Doug's family had come from Mexico on his dad's side. His dad, Jaime, had come to the United States from Mexico when he was 6. Jaime's dad, Jesus, had been in the Mexican Senate. And as a member of an anarchist party that lost in the Mexican Revolution, they had to flee and came to Los Angeles as a family in 1921. We visited my family in New Orleans yearly, and so I knew them pretty well, and I knew that they were quite capable of saying blatantly racist things. And I warned Doug about this before we visited there. So in the summer of 1981, Doug and our infant daughter Mara and I went to Mandeville. And Mandeville is the small town on the north side of Lake Pontchartrain from New Orleans. It's on the other side of the 26-mile causeway that connects the two. And it's where my family had taken white flight over the years and where my parents had returned to live after my dad had retired from his job outside Chicago. We knew that when they talk, my immediate family, my parents and I knew that when they talk and they say these racist things, we sit there, we don't speak up. The value that was communicated really without words was we're on their turf. It would be rude to confront them. And besides, we don't want bad blood in the family. So we didn't speak up. In that summer of 1981, when we went to visit, Doug and I went to what we called the compound. The compound was a cluster of 3 houses owned by my father's twin aunts, Aunt Etta and Aunt Mimi, and Etta's daughter, Therese. And it was in the midst of the very dark and moss-hung trees of the pine forest that then surrounded Mandeville. And the one place in that compound where the sun really shone through was at Aunt Mimi and Uncle Sam's pool, because they had to carve out space for the pool. So we went over one day and Mimi welcomed us with her warm heart and open arms like she always did. "Oh, Mary Dolan, it's so good to see you. Come on, have a seat. Come on, let's sit down by the pool." We sat down, we started chatting. How was the flight down? How's your mama's cancer coming? What do you want for lunch? June made us some wonderful red beans and rice yesterday, only she hasn't shown up today. Those people live like animals. We should send them all back to Africa. Nobody said anything. The silence was as heavy as the moss hanging off the trees. I looked at Doug. He had big eyes like, whoa, so this is what you were talking about. But he was squirming in his seat and he was looking down and kind of smiling, and I could see that something was coming. And he said, "Yeah, and while we're at it, we're going to send you all back to France and Germany." I smiled. I looked down. I didn't say anything. Uncle Sam chuckled. Aunt Mimi even chuckled. And then the conversation just picked right back on up and we went on. We were talking about how my other Uncle Sam was doing. This is my father's brother. He had come back from World War II, shell-shocked, and suffered from post-traumatic stress. And he had come back a very damaged and different person. So we were talking about how he and his family were doing. And that got us to talking about how all the other aunts and uncles, what they were doing during World War II. And the women, Aunt Etta and Aunt Mimi, were just talking about how they were waiting all the time. They were waiting for their husbands. They were waiting for letters. They were waiting for news, just waiting. And Uncle Sam said he had been a sailor in the Navy and that he had been stationed at Long Beach. Now we know that the Navy did not integrate till 1948. So we know that these were white sailors at Long Beach Naval Station. And Uncle Sam said, yeah, me and my buddies, we'd go up to LA on the weekends and Lord would beat up on some pachooks. Pachooks is a word that comes from Pachuco or Pachuca, which is the name that Mexicans and Mexican Americans gave themselves in the Southern California during that era. Pachooks is a racial slur. Now, Doug is a historian and he knew all about the fact that Navy white guys had done a lot of beating up on Mexicans and Mexican Americans during World War II. And there were even race riots caused by them. And when he heard that Sam had been one of them, he said, well, Sam, you could have been beating up on my Tio Jacobo because he was fixing engines in the service in LA at that time. I was stunned. I was frozen in my chair. I didn't say anything. I was grateful that he had said something, anything, but I was also mind blown by the fact that my uncle could have been beating up on his uncle. Uncle Sam chuckled, thought it was really quite amusing, shaking his head. What a coincidence. Aunt Mimi smiled and offered to go get some lunch. My silence went on for quite a few years. Many times I knew I should speak up, never did. I often didn't. Just was afraid. The instruction, the nonverbal instruction I'd gotten as a white person to just keep the silence was dying very hard in me. I just have had a very hard time with it. But I did do a few, I've started to speak up some. I started very easy, like when I was in a store and the storekeeper wanted to help me in front of the African-American woman who had been in front of me in line. And I said, no, she was in front of me. It's her turn. And getting a little more courage together with a close friend of mine later who said, I don't see race. And I said, if you don't see race, you must be blind and you're not seeing them. So it's still uncomfortable for me. I'm still learning. I'm still trying to do this thing of speaking up. But here's what I think about the fear. It's like stunted growth. It's like frozen in time. It's like a trauma response. Only in this case, it's other people that are experiencing the trauma. I continue to work on the feelings of fear, and I try to do it anyway. My Uncle Sam was a peculiar mix of traits. He was charming, compelling, humorous, but he also had a dark underbelly of discrimination and violence. Doug later told me, much later, that he had learned later that Tio Jacobo had actually been fixing his engines in the Army in South Dakota during that time. So it's not true that my uncle was beating up on his uncle. But what I learned that day was that my Uncle Sam was beating up on somebody's uncle. He was beating up on some Pachuco's uncle. And somebody didn't speak up. And so it kept happening, and it keeps happening. I'm speaking up now. I'm telling you about Uncle Sam. I'm telling you about my silence. But since I discovered Amanda Gorman on Inauguration Day 3 months ago, I have a new mantra. It's a slight paraphrase of her poem. There is always light if only I'm brave enough to say it.